Amen. Lovely, lovely. It is either a foolish or a courageous preacher, or perhaps both, who would voluntarily choose to do a sermon series on the Ten Commandments. It feels a bit like how it feels each year facing the Easter and Christmas stories, wondering what I can possibly say that is fresh, interesting, or helpful in the face of such well-known verses. And indeed, the Ten Commandments are well known, although perhaps not quite as well known as we may think. After all, 60% of Americans can't name even half of the commandments, and only barely half know that the Golden Rule is not a part of the Ten Commandments. A survey a few years ago showed that while 80% of Americans could name the primary component of a Big Mac, 2 all-beef patties, and 62% knew that the Big Mac had a pickle, only 33% correctly answered that remember the Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments. Far less than the 43% who could name every member of the Brady Bunch. The Ten Commandments were the subject of one of Cecil B. DeMille's earliest silent movies in 1923, and our cultural cinematic image for them was, for a generation, fixed in the popular mind by Charlton Heston's portrayal in 1956. Folks have fought over whether they could be put in courtrooms and on courthouse lawns, in schools and in parks. The phrase itself has become so commonplace that when folks want to create a set of rules about something, they will often call them the Ten Commandments of this or that. And so, for example, you can find the Ten Commandments for the internet, and the Ten Commandments of computer ethics, the Ten Commandments of Italian cooking, and the Ten Commandments for raising chickens. But for all the ubiquity of the image, I would suggest that we may not really know the Ten Commandments as well as we think we do, and that therefore a reintroduction to them is a worthwhile thing to do. The first thing to note, though, is that we will fail to truly understand the Ten Commandments if we don't see them in their context. Without that context, it is like those laws that are still on the books but which now seem baffling because we no longer know their history. For instance, in Alabama, it is illegal to put salt on a railroad track. And in Kentucky, the law says that you may not carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket. But what we don't now recall or know is that these laws originated from real situations. In the mid-19th century, anti-railroad vandals would put salt on railroad tracks, which attracted cows to lick the salt, which caused more than a few horrible train accidents. And there was apparently a court case from the late 19th century where a defendant charged with horse stealing claimed that he didn't steal the horse, but the horse only followed him home accidentally because he put an ice cream cone in his back pocket. Sounds like a rather sticky way to steal a horse to me. Without the context and the history of a particular law or rule, we find ourselves more puzzled than enlightened. It is the same with the Ten Commandments. Without their history and context, they too can seem to be simply arbitrary rules. But they are not, for they indeed do have a history and a context. And moreover, that history and that context is the history of the Jewish people and by God's gracious adoption of us into God's covenant with them, we Christians now as well. So let us do a little remembering of their context, which goes all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah and their children and their grandchildren are, you might say, the first family of faith. The first ones to whom God disclosed the divine self, the ones to whom God made the promise of a covenant that would include descendants outnumbering the grains of sands. Eventually, that family extended to Joseph, the one who was sold into slavery into Egypt, but who came to be the Egyptian chief of staff and who saved both the Egyptian people and the Hebrew people from extinction when a 7-year famine came and Joseph invited his extended family to flee to the protection of Egypt. And so the Hebrew people then lived on in Egypt for several centuries. But over the course of that time, the Egyptian government came to be no longer the protector of the Jewish people, but their oppressor. As it says in Exodus, there arose over Egypt a king who did not know Joseph. And so the Egyptian leaders began treating the Hebrew people harshly, going so far as to demand that their midwives kill all newly born Hebrew baby boys, and seeking to extinguish the people's worship of their ancient God, the God of Abraham and Sarah and their family. So it might be said that not only did Egypt come to have a king who knew not of Joseph and his family, so too had the Hebrew people, under the lash of Egyptian oppression, increasingly forgotten their God. In fact, if you read the 5th chapter of Exodus closely, when Moses confronts Pharaoh and asks that he let the Hebrew people go, it's not simply because they are being oppressed, but it is because in order that they can become reacquainted with and worship Yahweh, the God whom they have almost forgotten. And then, once the Hebrew people have finally fled Egypt and have stopped to catch their breath there at the base of Mount Sinai, God gives them these 10 commandments, or as some translations have it, 10 words, with a seemingly strange beginning. Did you notice it? Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, the first words of the 10 Commandments are God introducing himself or reintroducing. Why? Because the people did not know who that God was. They'd forgotten who the real Lord of their lives was. They thought that any God must be like the various capricious and cruel deities that the Egyptians had worshipped. Now do you begin to see why the historical context for the 10 Commandments is so crucial to truly understanding them? As a pastor by the name of Emily Heath puts it, quote, we're not just reading about some sort of divine law book with no longer relevant statutes. No, we're reading about the foundation for a covenant, for a relationship. We're reading about God reaching out to God's people and saying, you're not in that place of harshness and punishment anymore. You're not bound to me out of fear. You're bound to me out of love. You see, the Hebrew people's Egyptian experience had been that the gods were harsh, uncaring, capricious, even cruel. And so indeed they had to be reintroduced to the real God and be reminded that the covenant made so long ago with Abraham and Sarah still stood. And moreover, these wise words from God, these 10 commandments, also were meant to deliver the people from that exhausting business of trying to appease all those other so-called gods. And that's the point where we begin to find the first commandment's relevance for us today. In the words of one of my favorite preachers, Barbara Blaisdell, quote, "The magnificent insight of the Hebrew people is that there is but one God and one good in this world. In the time of Moses, though, most of the world served competing goods and competing gods. The god of rain demanded this sacrifice. The goddess of fertility required that one. And each person," Barbara says, "danced between the gods, trying to appease each one. And we do the same thing," she says. "We dance between all the demands on our lives to be good and to give to those less fortunate, to remember to call in our pledge to public television, to make our sacrificial gift to our church, to take care of ourselves at the gym and the mall and the bookstore, and don't forget aromatherapy and massage so we don't get burnt out. So many rain dances and rituals and sacrifices, so many gods to appease." My friends, what gods do you find yourself trying to appease? How do you need to be reintroduced to the one true God who is ever and only good? You see, the 10 Commandments, in the words of one preacher, quote, "constitute a way of life for people who know who they are and whose they are. People who are freed from the pharaohs of this world and freed for the worship of the Lord." Are you under the mistaken impression that God is an angry scorekeeper, one who's just waiting for you to slip up, one who has more to do with the pharaohs of this world than with the Lord of love whose mercies are new every morning? If that is you, or if you find yourself slipping into trying to appease a God who you don't think will act unless you say the right words, then surround yourselves with people who know that even though they are sinners, God's gentle, forgiving, overwhelming grace is indeed, as the hymn says, greater than all our sin. For the God who introduced the divine self to Abraham and Sarah and to Moses and to the Hebrew people ever wants to be reintroduced to you too, so that you can know the peace of not having to live in fear, so that you can remember that God alone is God, not the things that try to claim God-like power over your lives, not the nation, not our jobs, not our families, not our political parties, whether on the right or the left, not our ideologies. God alone is God. In that regard, let me close with some words from a sermon by a preacher named Joseph Morgan Smith. He says this: "By the time the Hebrew people actually made it to Mount Sinai," quote, "it had been so long since anyone had worshiped the Lord, they don't remember how. So Moses is summoned, and there comes this list of commandments. Don't have idols, don't steal, don't have sex with other people's spouses." Moses must be thinking, this doesn't sound like any worship service I've ever been to. So, it turns out, Our preacher continues, it turns out that God is less concerned about the kind of music we sing and whether our liturgy is low church or high church than with the way we live our lives. To worship the Lord, the story seems to suggest, is to be people redeemed by God from slavery in order to be faithful to God's commandments. And then he concludes this way. The Ten Commandments are ever the reminder that, quote, this thing between us and God matters. And because that is so, God cares about how we make our schedules, how we treat our parents, how we deal with our property, how we have sex, and that we tell the truth. And that we tell the truth. Indeed, the truth this morning is that those words so long ago to Moses, reintroducing God to a lost and frightened people, are not oppressive rules from a dictatorial deity, but, as the hymn says, wonderful words of life. That's the truth, indeed, for you and me. It's the truth that God wants you to share with those who have felt oppressed by wrongful ideas about God, those who need to know the joy of a life lived in the arms of a God who is love unbounded and grace unyielding. That is the truth. That is the truth. Will you go tell it with me?